Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine 18. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. I am here with a VR to a video by Natalia at Ouroboros, and this one is one that she's hashtagged Heartbreak, and it's about the Three of Swords. So I will leave a link to Natalia's video below, but if you haven't already watched, you might want to pause me and go watch Natalia's video for a little bit of context here for this conversation about how we interpret and understand the Three of Swords. So, very, very briefly, Natalia's video, I think, asks an important question, and it comes out of her noticing the differences between the depictions of the Three of Swords in the Thoth system and in Pamela Coleman Smith's imagery, or the Smith-Waite system of tarot. And so, she has some questions about what this kind of depiction of the Three of Swords, and this is the Gilded Tarot by Ciro Marchetti, which is just one that I had out for something else. What happens when we interpret this very kind of literal image of three swords piercing the heart in a literal way, right? That we end up with a kind of understanding of the Three of Swords as being about heartbreak, right? And for Natalia, this being a kind of a reduction of really the weight of the meaning that the Three of Swords as a card carries, right? And so she talks about the suit of swords as being, the mental plane, not, for example, the emotional plane of the cups. So heartbreak doesn't quite grasp it, right? And so this, the pain encapsulated in this card, having then a more, an internal source, right? A kind of, as opposed to, for example, a relationship ending and experiencing heartbreak about that, or something negative in the world happening that we could express with something like the Five of Cups, right? That this being in a sword suit means something quite different. And she uses the language of existential dread to talk about this, right? That totalizing weight of this card. And so I read the Suit of Swords very similarly to the way that Natalia talked about it, if not, the same way. I think of the swords as very much the mental plane, mentality, intellect. I think about swords and clarity, because swords, or lack of clarity, right? Depending on how a card shows up. Swords pierce through things. Swords cut through the nonsense to the heart of something. And, we think about how many blindfolds show up in the sword suit, which is at least a few. There's one in the Two of Swords, for example. There's another in the Eight of Swords. And because these kind of cards appear in the sword suit, the way that I read them anyway, the Two and the Eight with the blindfolds in them, these are very much about mindsets and mental states and mentality, right? They're not just emotional reactions to things. It's not just, an issue of feeling trapped in the Eight of Swords, for example, for me anyway. That Eight of Swords imagery with the figure with the blindfold and the swords surrounding them, if those swords speak to thoughts and ideas, then it's not so much a feeling of trappedness, but a mentality being trapped, a way of thinking being trapped, right? Not being able to get out of a particular way of thinking or way of interpreting the world, right? You could say similar things about the Two of Swords, I think. And so then, what I'm thinking as I'm watching Natalia's video, and I know nothing about the Thoth system. I don't own a Thoth deck, but I do work with and read Pip decks and Marseille style decks. So as I'm listening to Natalia talk about the swords and the significance of the suit, my mind then goes, on the other hand, well, what about the three, right? Because the way I read those Pip decks and Marseille style decks is generally reading the minors anyway. informed by the number plus the suit, right? So a numerological reading combined with the suit, which then means thinking about what threeness speaks to, right? And 3 as a number, for me, does not say heartbreak, right? At least not in that kind of emotional, end of relationship sort of way that we might immediately have conjured up by this image if we read it really literally, right? And I went back and looked at my notes from when I was doing Tarot on Earth, Tom Benjamin's book about learning to work with Pip style or Marseille style decks. And, there's an exercise in there where we think about, numbers and what their meanings are for us. And the words that I came up with after reading, a bunch of sources about the meanings of numbers, the words I came up with for 3 in my notes are fruition, growth, manifestation, and unfolding. So when I think of the 3 of Swords, if I think of fruition, growth, manifestation, unfolding, paired with the mental plane or the mentality or intellect of the sword suit or the element of air, if I were to represent that in anything like a literal way, I wouldn't go to something like this, right? Because this doesn't say, an idea coming to fruition, right? Not at all. So then I wanted to think a little bit about this 3, right? And how could I talk about that more numerological understanding of 3 in relationship to the Smith-Waite imagery, right? In order to get back to something like this image and what I would do with an image like that. So something that I really like from a book that I have that I also quite like. This is the book, A Beginner's Guide to Constructing the Universe, The Mathematical Archetypes of Nature, Art, and Science by Michael S. Schneider. And I found my way to this book by way of Brian Cormac Carr's channel. What they say, a sentence that I really like from this book in their chapter on 3, the author writes, without realizing it, we pierce polarity whenever we count 1, 2, 3, right? And this then gives something else to me in the suit of swords, right? Piercing polarity, because I see very much the polarity of the number 2 in the Smith-Waite depiction of the 2 swords held like this with the figure with the blindfold. I see that card and I think of being of 2 minds about something, being mentally or psychologically or intellectually torn between a duality or a polarity. And that card is one that to me evokes such stuckness and tension. That position of holding those heavy swords like that does not look comfortable, right? And there's a sense of indecision there, right? And so if you take this thinking about piercing polarity, and the weight of that too really coming down, then that gives this a lot more than, the idea of just emotional heartbreak that might be elicited by, a very literal reading of this image. Another brief quote from the book, the author writes that 3 announces wholeness and completion through embracing a synthesis, right? Embracing a synthesis, that polarity becoming a synthesis. And so there's something kind of totalizing about it almost, right? And something that is something present in the 2 that is broken out of and broken through at the 3, right? And so when I think of the depictions of the 3 of Swords that look like this, and the 2 of Swords that comes before it with the very, to me, a very torn image of the 2 swords, this to me is like the shift of going from a kind of indecision, a kind of tornness, to a realization, a realization that is devastating, in its weight. And using the word weight, which makes me think of Nietzsche and The Greatest Weight. And Natalia talked about Nietzsche in her video as well. I won't go there too much. But, it's one of the reasons that I think since I've been reading with more pip style decks and working more with more abstract decks or more Marseille style decks, I can get a bit frustrated with depictions that look like this, right? Because this is a very hard image to see anything other than negative, right? Like 3 swords piercing a heart. It's hard to find, that this is a good moment just from this image, right? If you give this image to someone who maybe doesn't know anything about tarot, they're not going to say that this is a good thing. But when you look at something more abstract that I really like, for numerological readings, like the Ouroboros Tarot, which is by Michael Bridge Dixon, and we go from the kind of singularity of the 1 in the ace to a splitting into a dichotomy or a duality of 2, going from dot to line. But then with 3, you go from dot to line to a 2-dimensional figure of a triangle, right? There's a manifestation there. There's a fruition there in terms of my numerological keywords, right? That 3rd line that forms a triangle is a kind of synthesis between the 3. And something like this, and you could work in reading reversals or, however you read the cards, is a lot more kind of capacious to me, right? It can certainly mean that, what do I want to say? This going from polarity or division or dichotomy to a kind of whole in a psychologically, mentally devastating way that this might suggest. But it can also suggest those things in a much less overtly, apparently negative way as well. So, yeah, this was a bit of a ramble. I grabbed my book with a couple of Post-its there, but didn't do too much playing other than that and grabbing my beloved Ouroboros Tarot deck. So just by way of wrapping up, I guess, this is all just to say, in terms of the 3 of Swords, I absolutely agree with Natalia that a very literal reading of this, as Heartbreak, misses a lot of the things that I see as potential meanings in the 3 of Swords. I agree. I think she mentions in her video as well that kind of emotional heartbreak is much more represented in, for example, the 5 of Cups. And that to me is true in both the Smith-Waite and in a numerological and suit-based reading with the conflict of the number 5. So I wanted to bring in, some discussion, not just of what it means that this card is in the context of the suit of swords, but also the discussion of the number 3, which I think is significant. And the fact that this appears on the 3 of swords and not some other card in the suit of swords, I think is also significant, at least significant to the way that I read this card. So I hope that this ramble was at least a little bit coherent. I'm looking forward to looking at other folks' VRs to this video and how other folks interpret the 3 of Swords, perhaps in other decks than I've shown. I'm always keen to discuss interpreting the cards with you. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and if you have thoughts that you'd like to share in the comments, please feel free. I would love to engage with you there. Have a good one. Bye.